The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the busy terminal. It was one of those typical summer mornings when the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the growing crowd of travelers, their rolling suitcases creating a symphony of wheels against the polished floor. Staff Sergeant Jonathan Morris stood patiently in line at Gate C-23, his crisp military uniform standing out among the sea of casual travelers in their comfortable flight attire. His combat boots were polished to perfection, reflecting his unwavering commitment to military standards even during personal travel. The weight of his small carry-on bag was nothing compared to the equipment he carried during his 3 tours in Afghanistan, but today's journey held a different kind of weight. He was finally heading home to surprise his family. The last 18 months had been particularly challenging. He'd missed his younger sister's college graduation, his father's 60th birthday, and countless Sunday family dinners. But now, with his upgraded first-class ticket clutched in his hand, a generous gesture from the airline's Military Appreciation Program, he was looking forward to 6 hours of comfort before the emotional reunion that awaited him. As he waited in the priority boarding line, an elderly couple in front of him turned around and smiled warmly. "Thank you for your service, son," the gentleman said, his own veteran's pin proudly displayed on his jacket lapel. Jonathan nodded appreciatively, a gentle smile crossing his face. These small moments of recognition always touched him, not because he sought praise, but because they reminded him of the connection between military service members and the civilians they protected. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the start of boarding for first-class passengers and active military personnel. Jonathan adjusted his uniform jacket and moved forward with his boarding pass ready. The familiar pre-flight excitement began to build in his chest, the kind that came not from the act of flying itself, but from knowing each mile would bring him closer to home. As he made his way down the jet bridge, Jonathan thought about his mother's cooking. She'd probably make his favorite honey-glazed chicken with sweet potato mash, even though it wasn't a Sunday. She always said special occasions deserved special meals, and coming home was the most special occasion of all. The aircraft's interior welcomed him with that distinct new plane smell. This was one of the airline's recently upgraded aircraft, with spacious first-class cabins featuring extended legroom and enhanced privacy. Jonathan checked his boarding pass again, Seat 2A, a window seat with a perfect view of both the runway and the sunrise. Flight attendants greeted him warmly as he made his way through the cabin, their genuine smiles and respectful nods acknowledging his service without making a fuss. That's exactly how he preferred it. Some of the early boarding passengers were already settling into their seats, organizing their belongings and preparing for the long flight ahead. Jonathan reached row 2, taking a moment to store his carry-on in the overhead compartment. The morning light streaming through the window painted the cabin in warm, golden hues, promising good flying weather. He could already imagine how the clouds would look from up above, like a soft, endless carpet stretching toward the horizon. Little did he know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. As he prepared to take his seat, he had no idea that the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would not only test his patience, but would also remind everyone present about the ongoing need for understanding and respect in our society. The cabin continued to fill with the usual pre-flight sounds, the soft thud of bags being stored, quiet conversations between passengers, and the occasional chime of the aircraft's systems coming to life. For Jonathan, it was all beautifully familiar, the calm before a storm he never saw coming. As Staff Sergeant Morris was about to settle into his window seat, a sharp voice cut through the ambient hum of the aircraft cabin. "Excuse me." The words came from a woman standing in the aisle, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her cream-colored business suit. Mrs. Barbara Chen, as her bag tag prominently displayed, had the kind of presence that demanded attention, not through warmth, but through an air of self-importance that seemed to fill the entire first-class cabin. "There must be some mistake," she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who was used to getting their way. She glanced between her boarding pass and the seat number, though it was clear the issue wasn't about seat assignments at all. Her eyes deliberately avoided making direct contact with the staff sergeant, instead focusing on the approaching flight attendant. The flight attendant, an experienced professional with over 15 years of service, approached with a practiced smile. "Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" Her name tag caught the overhead lighting as she moved closer to assess the situation. Mrs. Chen's response came in a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be heard by everyone nearby. "I paid full price for my first-class ticket," she began, emphasizing the words full price as if they carried special weight. "I don't feel comfortable with my seating arrangement." Her carefully manicured hand gestured vaguely in the staff sergeant's direction, still without actually looking at him. The other passengers in first class began to take notice. A businessman lowered his newspaper, his forehead creased with concern. An elderly couple exchanged knowing glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disappointment. The quiet murmur of pre-flight conversations died down as people turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Staff Sergeant Morris remained standing, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression neutral but dignified. He'd encountered prejudice before, but something about this moment, perhaps because he was still in uniform, perhaps because he was heading home to his family, made it sting a bit more than usual. Still, his military training had taught him to handle difficult situations with professionalism and restraint. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began diplomatically, "every passenger in first class has a valid ticket for their assigned seat. If you'd like to review your seat assignment, I'd be happy to." Mrs. Chen cut her off with a dismissive wave. "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice growing louder. "I frequently fly first class, and I have certain expectations about the quality of my traveling companions." She adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit that betrayed her awareness of the growing attention from other passengers. A young woman across the aisle had stopped scrolling through her phone and was now recording the interaction discreetly. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, had removed his AirPods and was watching the scene unfold with increasing disapproval. The staff sergeant finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Ma'am, I understand if you're uncomfortable, but I have a valid ticket for this seat." His words carried the weight of someone who had faced real challenges in life and found this situation more disappointing than threatening. Mrs. Chen's response was immediate and sharp. "Well, I need to speak to someone in charge. Surely there must be other seating arrangements that would be more appropriate." She emphasized the last word in a way that left no doubt about her implications. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. The flight attendant's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others watching with mounting indignation. What none of them realized was that this confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. Standing just a few rows back, observing everything with growing concern, was someone whose presence would completely change the dynamics of this situation. But for now, the tension continued to build in the first-class cabin, like storm clouds gathering before a thunderstorm. Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone, presumably to call customer service, her fingers trembling slightly despite her confident exterior. Whether from anger or embarrassment was hard to tell. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she continued, her voice rising. "I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately." The other passengers' reactions ranged from outright disapproval to uncomfortable silence. A gentleman in his 60s began to unfasten his seatbelt, clearly preparing to say something, while a young professional woman nearby was already raising her hand to get the flight attendant's attention, determined to voice her support for the staff sergeant. Little did any of them know that the most powerful response to this situation was about to come from an unexpected source, someone who had been quietly observing the entire scene unfold with growing determination to intervene. The flight attendant took a deep breath, drawing from years of experience in handling difficult situations. Her name badge caught the overhead light as she stepped slightly closer to Mrs. Chen, positioning herself between the agitated passenger and Staff Sergeant Morris. The morning sunlight streaming through the airplane windows seemed to dim, as if nature itself was acknowledging the tension in the cabin. "Ma'am," she began, her voice carrying both warmth and authority, "I want to help resolve this situation, but I need you to understand that all our passengers have equal rights to their assigned seats." She kept her tone low and professional, trying to prevent the situation from escalating further. But Mrs. Chen wasn't having it. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her designer handbag as she pulled out her phone. "Do you know how many miles I'd flown with this airline? I'm a platinum member." She held up her phone, displaying her airline membership profile. "I spend thousands of dollars every month on flights, and this is how I'm treated." The first-class cabin had become unnaturally quiet. The usual pre-flight rustling of magazines, clicking of seatbelts, and quiet conversations had all ceased. Every passenger was now fully invested in the unfolding drama, though many tried to pretend they weren't watching. A businessman in row 3 had removed his reading glasses and was openly frowning at Mrs. Chen. An elderly couple exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their disapproval. A young woman in a business suit had stopped typing on her laptop and was watching with increasing concern. Staff Sergeant Morris remained standing, his posture straight but not rigid. His eyes focused straight ahead, maintaining his dignity in a situation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. His combat boots, still dusty from his last tour, stood firmly on the carpet of the first-class cabin, a stark reminder of the real battles he'd faced compared to this unnecessary confrontation. The flight attendant tried again, her voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its professional courtesy. "Mrs. Chen, Staff Sergeant Morris has a valid first-class ticket for seat 2A. This is his assigned seat, and the airline's policy is very clear about." "Policy?" Mrs. Chen interrupted, her voice rising. "Well, your policy should also consider the comfort of your loyal customers. I'm not comfortable, and I demand something be done about it." Her voice had taken on a shrill edge that made several nearby passengers wince. A second flight attendant had appeared, drawn by the commotion. She quickly assessed the situation and moved to the aircraft phone, presumably to contact the lead flight attendant or perhaps the captain. The gentle background music playing through the cabin speakers seemed jarringly inappropriate against the tension of the moment. The first flight attendant maintained her composure, though a slight flush had crept into her cheeks. "Mrs. Chen, I need to be very clear. Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. If you're refusing to sit in your assigned seat because of prejudice against another passenger, I'll need to involve our ground supervisor." Several passengers nodded in approval. A gentleman in his 50s had already pressed his call button, clearly wanting to voice his support for the staff sergeant. Two young professionals were whispering to each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger at Mrs. Chen's behavior. Mrs. Chen's face flushed red, but she stood her ground. "Are you threatening me? I want to speak to your supervisor immediately. This is absolutely unacceptable." She fumbled with her phone, presumably trying to dial the airline's customer service number. The flight attendant reached for her own phone, ready to call for additional support. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. The air felt thick with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Staff Sergeant Morris finally spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse situations. "Ma'am, if it would make things easier, I can." But before he could finish his sentence, a new voice cut through the tension, a voice that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. It came from behind them, carrying a tone of authority that made everyone in the first-class cabin turn their heads. The morning light caught the medals and insignia of another military uniform, but this one belonged to someone whose presence would completely transform the confrontation. The passengers who could see the approaching figure fell silent, sensing that this story was about to take an unexpected turn. Standing quietly in the shadow of the first-class cabin's divider curtain, General David Richardson had witnessed the entire scene unfold. His presence had gone unnoticed amid the commotion, which was exactly how he preferred it. Decades of military service had taught him the value of observing before acting, and what he'd observed in the past few minutes had stirred something deep within him. The general's uniform bore the weight of countless medals and commendations, each telling its own story of service and sacrifice. His silver hair was cut to regulation perfection, and though he was in his early 60s, he carried himself with the same strength and authority that had earned him his rank. As a board member of the airline, he could have immediately pulled rank, but his military training had taught him to choose his moments carefully. He watched as Mrs. Chen continued her tirade, her voice growing increasingly shrill as she demanded to speak to someone in charge. The irony of her request wasn't lost on him. She had no idea that one of the airline's highest-ranking officials was standing mere feet away, witnessing her disgraceful behavior. The sunlight streaming through the aircraft windows caught the general's medals, creating tiny points of light that drew the attention of a young boy seated nearby. The child tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing quietly at the impressive figure standing in the aisle. One by one, other passengers began to notice him too, their expressions changing from concern to curiosity. General Richardson's mind flashed back to his own early days in the service when he'd faced similar prejudices. He remembered a young lieutenant who'd stood up for him then, changing the course of his military career. Now, decades later, he found himself in a position to do the same for another soldier. He observed Staff Sergeant Morris's composure with approval. The young soldier's dignified response to the situation spoke volumes about his character. The general noted how Morris kept his shoulders square and his expression neutral, displaying the kind of discipline that made the military proud. The flight attendant was still trying to handle the situation diplomatically, though her patience was clearly wearing thin. Two other crew members had gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing toward the cockpit. The captain would need to be notified soon if this situation wasn't resolved. Mrs. Chen had pulled out her phone again, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. "I have the CEO's office on speed dial," she announced to no one in particular, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks. They could sense that her bravado was beginning to crack. The general shifted his weight slightly, causing his medals to clink softly against each other. The sound drew more attention, and now nearly everyone in the first-class cabin was aware of his presence. The atmosphere began to change, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. He watched as a young business executive offered Staff Sergeant Morris a supportive nod, while an elderly veteran 2 rows back was practically rising from his seat, ready to intervene. The sense of community among the passengers, their silent support for the soldier, reminded him why he'd served all these years, to protect these moments of human decency. Mrs. Chen remained oblivious to the general's presence, still focused on her phone and her complaints. "This is outrageous," she continued, her voice carrying a note of desperation now. "I demand to speak to someone with actual authority." The morning sun had fully risen, filling the cabin with golden light that seemed to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Here was Mrs. Chen demanding authority, while one of the highest-ranking military officers and airline board members stood quietly observing her behavior. General Richardson took a deep breath, straightening his already impeccable uniform. He'd seen enough. The time for observation was over, now it was time for action. As he prepared to step forward, he caught Staff Sergeant Morris's eye, giving him a subtle nod that carried decades of shared military understanding. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The general's presence had created an invisible shift in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm breaks. What happened next would not only resolve this situation, but would serve as a powerful reminder about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of service. The sound of polished military boots on the aircraft's carpet caught everyone's attention as General Richardson stepped forward. His movement was deliberate and measured, each step carrying the weight of his 40 years of military service. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught his medals, creating a subtle but impressive display of his decorated career. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that only comes from decades of command. "I couldn't help but overhear that you're looking for someone in charge." The general's words cut through the tension like a knife through butter, causing Mrs. Chen to turn around sharply. The expression on her face shifted from irritation to surprise as she took in the sight of his uniform, the rows of medals, and his commanding presence. Her phone, which she'd been clutching like a weapon, slowly lowered to her side. "I'm General David Richardson," he continued, his voice remaining calm but firm. "I serve on the board of directors for this airline, but more importantly, I've spent the last 40 years serving alongside brave men and women like Staff Sergeant Morris." The first-class cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the usual airplane background noise seemed muted, as if the aircraft itself was listening. Mrs. Chen's face had lost several shades of color, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. "Ma'am," the general continued, taking another step forward, "I've been standing here for the past few minutes, watching you disrespect one of our nation's finest. Would you care to explain why you believe your platinum membership status outweighs his right to sit in a seat he properly booked? Mrs. Chen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the cabin, perhaps looking for support she wouldn't find. The other passengers were watching intently, many with barely concealed satisfaction at this turn of events. She stammered, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. You just what? General Richardson asked, his tone carrying not anger but disappointment. You just thought it was acceptable to discriminate against a soldier who has spent the last 18 months defending your right to travel freely and safely. The general turned slightly, addressing the other passengers as well. You see, Staff Sergeant Morris here wasn't upgraded to first class as a courtesy. He earned these miles during 3 tours of duty, flying back and forth to protect our country. Each mile represents a day away from his family, a day spent ensuring all of us, including you, Mrs. Chen, can enjoy our freedoms. A few passengers nodded in agreement. An elderly man with a veteran's pin on his lapel wiped a tear from his eye. The flight attendant stood respectfully to the side, knowing this moment needed no intervention from them. Now, the general continued, his voice taking on an official tone, as a board member of this airline, I want to make something very clear. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. This isn't just company policy, it's a reflection of the values our service members fight to protect. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Chen, whose face had now shifted from pale to bright red. You have 2 choices, ma'am. You can either take your assigned seat and demonstrate the kind of respect that every human being deserves, or you can leave this aircraft and find alternate transportation. The choice is yours, but it needs to be made right now. The cabin remained silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for Mrs. Chen's response. Staff Sergeant Morris stood perfectly still, his military bearing intact, though a slight smile had begun to form at the corners of his mouth. The general wasn't finished. And one more thing, he added, his voice softening slightly. When you make your decision, remember that whatever choice you make will probably be on social media within the hour. I noticed at least 3 passengers recording this interaction, and I can't say I blame them. Sometimes these moments need to be documented as a reminder of how we should and shouldn't treat each other. A young woman in row 3 quickly lowered her phone, looking slightly embarrassed but unapologetic. The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the cabin with clear, unforgiving light that seemed to highlight the importance of this moment, a moment when privilege and prejudice faced accountability in the most unexpected way. The silence in the first-class cabin felt heavy as everyone waited for Mrs. Chen's response. Her perfectly manicured fingers fidgeted with her phone, which she'd finally stopped threatening to use. The morning sunlight that had seemed so bright and promising earlier now felt like a spotlight, illuminating her every movement and expression. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, she cleared her throat. She began, her voice barely above a whisper, I think I'll take another flight. The words came out strained, as if each one cost her tremendous effort. A collective release of tension rippled through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks, while others didn't bother hiding their satisfied smiles. The flight attendant stepped forward, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obvious relief on her face. I'll help you gather your belongings, ma'am, she offered, her voice neutral but firm. As Mrs. Chen began to collect her things, her movements were jerky and rushed, like someone trying to escape a particularly embarrassing nightmare. The general watched silently, his presence still commanding respect even without words. Staff Sergeant Morris remained standing, his military bearing perfect, though his eyes showed a mix of relief and something else, perhaps pride in seeing another service member stand up for what was right. As Mrs. Chen pulled her designer carry-on from the overhead bin, she dropped her expensive handbag, spilling its contents across the floor. The silence in the cabin grew uncomfortable as lipstick, keys, and a wallet scattered across the aisle. A few months ago, passengers might have rushed to help, but now they all sat still, letting the moment play out. It was Staff Sergeant Morris who stepped forward, bending down to help collect her things. This simple act of kindness, helping someone who had just treated him with such disrespect, spoke volumes about his character. The general nodded approvingly, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. Mrs. Chen couldn't meet the staff surgeon's eyes as he handed her the gathered items. Her face had turned an even deeper shade of red, and her hands trembled as she stuffed everything back into her bag. The pearls around her neck seemed to have lost their luster, much like her earlier confidence. "You know," the general spoke up, his voice softer now, but still carrying throughout the cabin, "sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I hope you'll think about this day, Mrs. Chen, and perhaps see it as an opportunity for growth rather than just embarrassment." As she hurried toward the exit, the click of her expensive heels against the floor seemed to emphasize each step of her retreat. The flight attendant followed close behind, already radiating the professional calm that would be needed to handle the paperwork and arrangements for a passenger leaving the flight. Just before she reached the door, Mrs. Chen paused. For a moment, it looked like she might turn around, might offer an apology or some explanation for her behavior. But instead, she straightened her designer jacket and continued through the door without looking back. The moment she disappeared, several passengers broke into spontaneous applause. An elderly couple in row 4 smiled broadly, while a young business executive gave Staff Sergeant Morris a thumbs up. The tension that had filled the cabin began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of justice served and dignity maintained. The general turned to Staff Sergeant Morris, extending his hand. "Thank you for your service, son," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "And thank you for showing the kind of character we expect from our best soldiers, even in difficult situations." The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light filling the cabin with a different kind of energy. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had transformed into a powerful reminder of dignity, respect, and a quiet strength of character that truly deserves first-class treatment. Several passengers were already on their phones, no doubt sharing what they'd witnessed. In the age of social media, this story would probably go viral before the plane even took off. But more important than any viral moment was the lesson that had played out in front of them. A lesson about standing up for what's right, about dignity in the face of discrimination, and about the true meaning of first-class behavior. As the aircraft doors finally closed and the plane prepared for takeoff, the morning's events had already begun spreading beyond the first-class cabin. Flight attendants could be heard discussing it in hushed tones as they completed their pre-flight checks. In economy class, passengers were sharing whispered versions of what had happened up front, each retelling adding to the story's impact. General Richardson hadn't returned to his original seat. Instead, he'd taken the spot next to Staff Sergeant Morris, the two military men falling into easy conversation about their service experiences. The general pulled out his business card and handed it to the younger soldier. "I meant what I said about upgrading your next few flights," he said warmly. "But more than that, I'd like you to keep in touch. We need more soldiers like you, ones who maintain their dignity even when others lose theirs." He paused, looking thoughtful. "In fact, I'd like you to come speak to some of our new recruits about what happened today, if you're willing." The other first-class passengers had settled into a buzzing atmosphere of shared experience. A young couple a few rows back had already posted their video of the incident online, and their phones kept lighting up with notifications as the story began to gain traction. The elderly veteran who had watched everything unfold reached across the aisle to shake Staff Sergeant Morris's hand, his eyes bright with emotion. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the story had gone viral. Major news networks were picking it up, and social media was ablaze with discussions about respect, dignity, and standing up against discrimination. But perhaps more importantly, something special was happening on the ground. The airline's corporate offices were flooded with messages of support. By early afternoon, they had issued a formal statement reinforcing their zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and announcing a new initiative, a comprehensive training program for all staff members, using this incident as a teaching moment. They named it the First Class Character Program, focusing not on ticket prices, but on treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The story's impact continued to grow. Veterans groups shared it widely, celebrating both the staff surgeon's composure and the general's intervention. Military training programs incorporated it into their leadership courses, using it as an example of how to handle discrimination with professionalism and grace. A week later, the airline's board of directors held an emergency meeting. Under General Richardson's guidance, they expanded their military appreciation program and established a new scholarship fund for minority service members pursuing commercial aviation careers. The incident had transformed from a moment of shame into a catalyst for positive change. Staff Sergeant Morris's family got an even better surprise than they'd expected when he finally made it home. Instead of just their son coming through the arrival gate, they'd found themselves greeted by a small crowd of well-wishers, including several high-ranking military officials and airline executives. His mother burst into tears of pride when she heard how her son had handled himself. Local schools began requesting visits from both the staff sergeant and the general, eager to have them speak about integrity, respect, and standing up for what's right. The two men always made time for these appearances, understanding that their story had become something larger than themselves, a teaching moment for future generations. Mrs. Chen's story took a different turn. After a few days of reflection, she did something unexpected. She wrote a public apology letter. In it, she acknowledged her behavior had been inexcusable and spoke about the hard lessons she'd learned about prejudice and privilege. She requested that instead of judging her, people should learn from her mistake and examine their own biases. The airline framed the incident report alongside their new inclusion policy in their corporate headquarters. They didn't include Mrs. Chen's name or photo. This wasn't about shaming one person, but about learning from a moment when humanity had both failed and triumphed in the space of a few minutes. 3 months later, during a military appreciation ceremony, General Richardson stood at a podium, addressing a crowd of service members and civilians alike. Sometimes, he said, his voice carrying across the hushed audience, our finest moments come not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of dignity in the face of indignity. That day on the plane, we didn't just see discrimination challenged, we saw character revealed. The story continues to be shared today, not just as a tale of what went wrong, but as a reminder of how to make things right. In airport training rooms across the country, new flight attendants learn about it. In military briefings, young soldiers discuss it. And in countless conversations, people still talk about that morning when a first-class seat became a stage for a lesson in true first-class character.